Hey everyone, welcome back to another Timer Tip Tuesday. Unfortunately, GoToWebinar is having an issue with cameras, so none of our cameras are working, so you don't get to see our beautiful faces. So you'll have to just suffice with the audio. And yeah, so as is usual, we are going to be recording, and we'll share this out to our YouTube channel afterwards. Feel free to use the questions panel if you have any questions throughout the session. I've got Soren on the back end here helping me out. And today we're going to be talking about segments. Segments is kind of the next step if you are just learning RaceDay scoring. After the 101 of taking your certification class, doing segments and learning how to set up segments is a really good next step. So today we're going to be kind of walking through the basics of segments, what they are, how to set them up, some more standard examples, and then some more advanced examples. We aren't going to go super deep on the advanced examples, but we will touch on them today. We're going to have a follow-up session that's more advanced that will dig into the details of those more advanced scenarios in that session. I think that's actually next week. And then at the end, we'll have a Q&A. So yeah, we can go ahead and get started with segments. We'll start off with what they are. So they're basically how RaceDay scoring calculates times and paces for participants. And they use a bunch of different information to generate those times. So they use timing locations, like as start and end points to each segments to calculate the time it takes to get between those locations and occurrences. So basically, over on the right here, I have a little graphic. Participant goes from start to finish. The segment is the time it takes to get from start to finish. All segments are going to have an entire race segment by default, and that's going to be the time it takes to go from the very start of the race to the end of the race. And then you can also just add additional segments to create additional splits, multiple laps, and other definitions or segments, splits within the race. So there's a lot of different things you can do with segments, and we're going to dive into that more next. So on the right here, I've got a little graphic example of what would be a very common, basic kind of segment definition. The one at the top is basically saying, okay, the entire race default segment is going to be how long it takes to go from the start to the finish of the whole course. Each of these has a segment distance and a cumulative distance. This is really important to understand when you're learning about setting up segments. It's a major difference. A segment distance is how long this segment is, whereas a cumulative distance is how long the participant has gone since the very beginning of the race, regardless of where the segment is. So the good example is at the bottom here, I've added two segments to this race. I've added one that is the first 5K and one that is called the second 5K. The second 5K has a cumulative distance of 10K because when they complete the second 5K, they've done 10 kilometers in total. Whereas the first one, they've only done 5 kilometers in total. Now you'll notice on the second 5K, the segment distance is 5K because it's saying that, hey, this particular segment is 5 kilometers. But at the tail end of it, when they finished it, they've done 10 kilometers in total. This is important because some types of events like to report cumulative distance and paces and so on, while other types of events like to report the segment distances. So for example, a triathlon, you probably don't want to show the pace at the end of the bike leg based on how long it was from the beginning of the race, right? You would really want to just show the pace for the segment itself. So for triathlons, you typically hide all the cumulative distances and paces, and you just show the segment distances and paces. Now, the other example is like a road race, like a marathon, where you have split points throughout the course, 5K, 10K, 15K, 20K, so on and so forth. What you want to show in those instances is the total time it takes, or the total pace or distance from the very beginning of the race, because usually it's like a half marathon split. You don't want to report how long it took them to get from the 5K split to the half marathon split, right? You usually want to show how long it took to get from the very beginning. So this is something to consider when you're setting these up and learning how to configure them. There's some other things we can talk about a little more in depth later. One of the coolest features we have is a minimum allowed time, and that is a way that you can say, I want to make sure that no one does a 5K within this race faster than 13 minutes or something. Okay, so let's talk about how to actually set this up. Number one, and on the race dashboard, use the little toolbar on the left and go to the segments option. It's a little plotted line with points on it. And then you can come into this screen and you can add segments. You can switch which event you are working on. It's very important to understand that the segments page is specific to the event that you're looking at. So here I've got a 5K, let's say a 5K and a 10K. In that drop down, there will be a selection of either 5K or 10K. So really important to understand this, because when you start adding segments, you are not adding them for all of the events in your race. You're only adding them for the event you currently have selected here. Now, we do have the ability to copy segments from one race to another, or event to another, rather. That's right next to the event selection. So that's really handy if you have a triathlon with a lot of different events, but the courses are somewhat similar. You can copy the segments from one event to another event, and then you can go over to that event and actually make the adjustments that you need. Like, for example, a duathlon, it has a similar structure because there's 5 segments, but the segment names are different. So in that example, you might set up your triathlon segments, copy them to the duathlon, and then go over to the duathlon and make your adjustments as needed. And that touches on a very important part of the way segments work, because we have like one form that when you click save, it saves all of the segments for all of the events in your race. It's not just saving the segments for the event you currently have selected. And this is really important because, well, number one, it allows us to do the copying segments feature. But number two, if you have an error on one of the events, it'll tell you which event the error is on. So down here, I messed something up. I made the endpoint occurrence wrong, and it's telling me that I have an error in the relay event, but I currently have the duathlon event selected. So I wouldn't be able to figure out what's going on here. So if you see an error about segments, you have them set up incorrectly, just make sure that you read the message carefully, because it might be the case that you aren't looking at the right event that has the error. And in this case, it's saying that the cumulative distance is unequal to another with the same endpoint in distance. This is a very common error message for segments, and I want to explain it to everyone because a lot of people don't understand what it means. Basically, if you have a segment that ends at a given occurrence, so it ends at occurrence 2 on the finish line, any other segments that also finish on that same location and occurrence within that same event are gonna have to be the same cumulative distance. So like you can't have let's say 2 segments, like one is the 10K and one is the 5K, and they both finish at the same occurrence and location, because that wouldn't make any sense. The system wouldn't know how to differentiate the two. So usually what happens here is just you have one of the locations wrong or you have one of the occurrences wrong, and it's clear once you look at it, but it's a little bit confusing to read. So if you get that kind of message, just double check all of the segments that are named there and the events in the error message. Just check the finish location and occurrences that you've used there and make sure they make sense. So this just goes into detail about how the segment definitions are actually built. They're set up using a start point and a start point occurrence and an endpoint and an endpoint occurrence. These are determined by the locations, just noting that they need to have at least as many occurrences as the expected segment is using. So in the timing location setup, you have to say, hey, at this location, let's say finish location for a 5K and 10K course has to accept a maximum of 2 occurrences, because you want to use those occurrences in your segment definitions. You want to say the first time they hit this location at the finish, that's the first lap of the 10K, and that's a 5-kilometer lap. And then the next one, the second time they hit it, will be the finish, and it would also be the finish of that second lap. Now, if the segment that you're setting up begins at a clock start, you can choose clock start for the start point and for the scored event whose clock start should be used as the beginning of that segment. So if you're doing a clock start race, you can use the clock start option in the start point. If you're doing a chip timed race, you would use a start point. So next, when you name segments, just be aware that this is what's going to display in RunSignup results and will be exported in reports. So name them appropriately. Sometimes people like to make the segment names specific to the event. If you have a bunch of scored events that use similar segment names, just so they can easily pick them out. But just a note there. Just one thing you may have noticed when you are building out segments, we do show you kind of a summary of how the segment is structured at the top here. And basically this is telling you the start and the end points and the occurrences used at each. So this is saying my 10-mile segment, it's a 5-mile segment distance, and it starts at the beginning of the first occurrence on the 5-mile timing location, and it goes to the first occurrence at the 10-mile timing location. So as we noted before, this is the distance from the segment distance is the distance from the beginning of this segment to the end of this segment. And the cumulative distance, again, is the total distance accumulated for this occurrence at this endpoint for the entire race. So up until this point, they have done 10 miles total. Pace type. This is an important feature to notice and to note because few reasons. Number one, it should be set based on the event or the discipline. So for a triathlon, you probably don't want to show the pace for a transition area, and you probably want to show miles per hour for the bike leg. So basically for that transition segment, you would just set this to do not display. And then for the bike segment, you would set it up as miles per hour. Another really cool thing about RaceDay scoring is the pace type is totally separated from the distance unit type. So here I have it set to be 5 miles and 10 miles. But if I were doing like a 5K, 10K, I could have the segment distances be 5 kilometers, but the pace type reported in minutes per mile and vice versa. I don't have to have them matching unit types. It's just kind of neat. Next, the minimum allowed time. This is a way to basically restrict any participants from having a time for this segment that is less than whatever you put in here. So this is helpful in some cases if it's kind of similar to gap factors in a way. So let's say you had that 5K, 10K course where some people are doing 1 lap and they're a 5K and they're done. Other people are doing 2 laps and it's a 10K. You could set it up with a gap factor and just say, hey, no one should do less than 13 minutes of a gap factor between reads, period. And that would work. But, you know, in other situations, you may want to have different minimum times allowed on an individual segment level. If you know that like one part of the course has, they shouldn't be doing faster than this amount, you can set it on the segment level itself. Really handy for triathlons and stuff. This next setting here is a little complicated, but basically what it's doing is it's saying that you want to restrict earlier segments from being completed if this one has already been completed. This comes up quite often if you have an out and back style course where participants will go out one road and then they maybe do a loop and then come back down the same road. If you have segments set up to use a split point on course that will be hit on the way out and on the way back, you might run into situations where participants miss the read on the way out, but get it on the way back, and there's a split point like at the turnaround. In that case, if we missed that going out read, but got the going back read, and we got the split at the turnaround, you'd have a situation where you could have a negative split time for the going out, because we saw that they got a split read at 10 a.m. and then they got their first occurrence on what we thought at the time, the going out leg, that was at 10:15. So that would give them a negative 15-minute first split, which obviously is wrong. because they just missed that first going out read. So what you could do is you could enable this setting to say, hey, this segment, I know that once participants, complete this one, I don't want to take earlier reads. And the system thinks that that earlier read is part of the first segment because of the cumulative distance of that segment. So I said on the way out, there's a reader, it's 1 mile in, and the cumulative distance is what 1 mile is there. On the way back, it's 3 miles or whatever, let's say. So because it was at 1 mile and the turnaround was 2 miles, I would ignore any reads that would complete the 1 mile split if the setting were on. So basically, it's a way to prevent negative times if you have an out and back style course. That's the way you can think about it more simply. Next, a pretty nice feature, the hide from report columns. This is handy if you want to set up segments, but you don't want to include them in your default reports. So by default, RaceDay Scoring creates a report that includes splits if splits are set up. And so it's really easy, and you don't have to worry about adding additional columns. But sometimes, hey, James, just mute yourself, thanks. Sometimes you don't want those columns included in your default reports, so you can just easily hide them here. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't add them to reports later. You always can, but you just have to do that manually. So a lot of times people want to have supplemental segment data, and what they do is they set up the segments, hide them from report columns, and then they just build a custom report to show that data. So there's lots of examples there. But next, kind of touched on this a bit earlier, but you can use the copy segments if you wanted to copy segments from one event to another, like a marathon to a marathon relay, or a triathlon to a duathlon.
All right, standard splits. So when we talk about standard splits, most of the time we're dealing with a single discipline event. So just running, just biking, just skiing, and so we would kind of consider this more of like the standard split experience versus the multi-discipline, which we'll talk about in a moment. So most of the time that these are used to give participants more feedback post-race, see how their pace changed over time. They're used to enhance the spectator experience through tools like RaceJoy or text notifications, and also to allow the timer to evaluate participant performances and just kind of see, if someone has an unrealistic performance, if they're missing a split that's key for that distance, or maybe if they ran a different course. When you are considering where to put a split map that would be used to build these segments, there's a couple criteria that are useful to look at. The first is the data useful to the participant? Is this increment that the segment will be built something that makes sense? Is it a 5K, 5 mile, halfway? And that may differ depending on what type of sport is going on. Is the data useful for spectators? Does this help them predict where to cheer for friends and family, or know when they will finish? So is this something that's going to enhance the spectator's experience? Another thing to look for when setting up splits is the data useful to you as the timer? Can this help you tell if someone cut the course, if it's on an out and back segment that could easily be skipped? Or is it something that's on a unique course? Is it something that's on the 10K course only, and you can tell that someone ran the 5K if they missed this? And then finally, is the location for the hardware accessible? Or now we have this option where if the density is low enough, you could implement mobile timing as kind of a pseudo chip system. So those are kind of some things to look at for choosing where to put these splits and locations. They may also be dictated by the event organizers themselves. So kind of standard split setups for a running event, for example. This requires an occurrence between the start and the finish of the scored event. This can be completely separate stream and location, or this can be an intermediate occurrence. For example, if you had a course that was 5 kilometers in distance, but they lap the course. And so to do a 10K, they have two occurrences on the finish line. In the example below, the 5K split is the first lap over the finish line, which we talked about a little bit earlier, is making sure that if you do have a situation like this, if you do have a setup like this, that your finish location is set to take at least two occurrences. And also it's important to just kind of reiterate that when you're setting up a location, that location is set up to take as many occurrences as are expected by all events using that location. And just another reminder, the same stream can be mapped to multiple locations if that's just not feasible for your workflow. It's important to remember that if there are multiple splits on the course, the segment should be set up from the previous location to the current location. In the example below, that's from the 5K split location to the 10K split location. RaceDay scoring automatically handles the cumulative information based on the distance input. So again, like you're seeing these examples over and over, but I think that they're very important concepts. So this 10K split is from the 5K to the 10K. That is the segment, the chopped up part of the course, but the cumulative distance is 10K. And I think this is also a good time to let you know and kind of discuss the fact that if you wanted to have a standalone segment that is multiple parts of the course, that is like maybe you had 5K, 10K, 15K, 20K, but you wanted to have the entire first half of the marathon, you could set up a standalone segment that is the first half of the course, even though there's these splits in between. And that one could very easily be just the start to the half marathon split. So you can use the same locations to make multiple splits there. The biggest thing that I would say for doing this is one, be aware that you can edit the split column in the reports and choose to show all cumulative or not show all cumulative. But two, and probably more importantly for everything, test what that looks like for yourself. Make sure that it looks how you want it to look, and it looks how the organizers want it to look, and it looks how the participants and spectators are going to want it to look. So that's the kind of standard, all the same discipline. Everything has the same pace type. Everything is kind of put out in these increments that make sense for that type of event. But for multi-sport or triathlon segments, it's a little bit different. So multi-sport segments differ from the single discipline ones because you may want to be separating out each of the disciplines from the others on the whole, even if there's splits within the discipline. So think about this as like triathlon and duathlon are the classic examples of this. So for a triathlon, the expected segments are a swim, a transition one, a bike, transition two, and a run. But you might have splits on the bike course itself. That being said, it is necessary to create this kind of simple report, as USAT sanctioned events will require reporting in this format with leg one, transition one, leg two, transition two, and leg three. It's also kind of the expected format for participants. And again, this goes back to the earlier point. If you're doing these things, test it. Make sure it looks the way you want. Maybe you want to have a simplified triathlon report, and then maybe you want to have one that includes all of those bike splits. There is that option on the segment page to hide splits and reports, and you can do that by default. And then you could go ahead and build a report that included those. The other thing that's important to reiterate with multi-sport segments is that these are different disciplines, and so there's different expectations of pace type. So usually it's minutes per 100 yard or 100 meters for swim, miles per hour or kilometers per hour for bike, minutes per mile or minutes per kilometer for run. And then just a reminder, do not display should be used for the transitions. So when we're setting up those transition segments, the time that participants spend switching disciplines in a transition area or transition zone, it's common practice to set that segment distance to 0. partially because it's not something that's part of the quote unquote course, but also because that distance actually varies from participant to participant depending on where maybe their bike is on the racks. Um, Participants and spectators don't expect to see paces for these segments, but they do expect to see the transition times here, because that has kind of implication on where people are placing throughout the course as they move through it. So don't hide transitions from reports, but do set the pace type to do not display, because again, the segment distance is 0 here. The cumulative distance, however, should match the cumulative distance at the end of the segment that preceded the transition. Um, it is helpful and recommended to set a minimum allowed time for transition segments, but do keep in mind that if you're setting this up and copying it from the individual sprint triathlon to the relay sprint triathlon, relay teams go through these transitions and exchanges very quickly, so you will probably want to adjust that minimum allowed time. So just a note on the segment you can see down below. Transition one here, they had a kilometer swim first, and so the cumulative distance is set to 1 kilometer here. Another type of segment that we're going to cover today is rest segments. Rest segments are a unique type of segment that represent time not spent participating in the event. They're actually subtracted from the entire calculation of the event, which is finish minus start. These are most commonly used for like your combo or challenge events where participants will participate in 2 or more scored events, but also have a combined time for those 2 events. So for this challenge example, let's say they run a 5K first, and then later they run a 10K. And then we also want to score them with their total time for the 5K and 10K. The 5K would be the first segment, the start of the 5K to the end of the 5K. And then there would be a rest segment between the end of the 5K and the start of the 10K. And then finally, there'd be a 10K as the third segment there. It's also worth noting that if you had multiple of these, just making sure that you're setting them up again to be hidden. It's not expected to see these pieces. Another use for rest segments would be certain types of ultras or lap events where participants can take breaks between running some or all of the course. So to set up a rest segment, there's kind of a lot of similarities between a transition segment and a rest segment, but there are also a couple differences that really need to be articulated here. Again, with a rest segment, the distance is 0. Who knows what they're doing in between there? Maybe the 5K Saturday, the 10K Sunday. They could be walking all over, or they might be taking a nap right there. The cumulative distance, however, should match the end of the segment that preceded the rest segment. So, for example, in that combo challenge event, we're kind of hypothetically talking about they do the 5K first, and so the cumulative distance for the rest segment would be 5K. As that's kind of how we line stuff up. Again, cumulative distance, whenever you're talking about segments, is just really important to understand. You can drag and reorder how the segments show, and that is the order that the segments are displaying top to bottom on the segment list are how they show in the reports and on RunSignup. But the cumulative distance is used to order the events in terms of how you're flowing through them, both for our new default data check that looks for missed splits, and also for the once this segment has been completed option. So for rest segments, again, pretty self-explanatory, but you need to select is rest segment for this to be subtracted from the total time. Make sure that you're only doing this if it truly is a rest segment. For example, a transition segment is not a rest segment normally. There's certain, non-traditional triathlons where that may be the case, but by and large, rest segment is time that should be subtracted. It's also common practice to hide these from the reports, like I said. No one really wants to see it. It doesn't have a lot of use. So here's an example of that challenge setup, like we said before. It's a 15K total distance, because it's a 5K and a 10K. The 5K being set to have a segment distance of 5K, a cumulative distance of 5K. And again, you can see that there's a minimum allowed time in here. The 5K start finish is the start, and the second occurrence there is the end point, the finish of the 5K. And then we have rest here. You can see that rest segment is selected. We're hiding it from report columns. There's 0 segment distance and 5 kilometers of cumulative distance. And this goes from the end of the 5K, the second occurrence of the 5K start finish, to the 10K start on the first occurrence of the 10K start finish. You'll also notice that for this rest segment, and for rest segments in general, there's not a minimum allowed time set. And then finally, we have the 10K, which is 10 kilometers for segment distance, 15 kilometers cumulative, because again, at the end of this, they've accumulated 15 kilometers of distance. We do have a minimum allowed time. And then the start and end mapping are basically what you would expect from the start and finish of the 10K scored event. It is worth noting here that if you're doing a combo or challenge event, similar to the simplified triathlon report, there's not the expectation of having splits shown on it. If we had, maybe 3 splits on the 10K course, for the challenge report, we'd probably only want to show the 5K time and the 10K time. If they're in one of these super sub event situations, they can always go and look at the 10K report to see what their splits are there. So again, like when you create these reports, think about the utility and what people are going to go there looking for. If they want their splits, they'll go to the 10K. If they want to see how they did in the combo with both events, they'd go to the combo challenge report.
All right, so next we're going to talk a little bit about lap segments. So again, we're going to go too in depth on this one. I'm going to cover a bit more in the upcoming webinar on this, but we do want to cover it just a little bit. So lap events also can have have segments where 2 or more segments are added up to create a lap. So basically, locations are still used in lap segments similar to traditional splits. They're added together to get a full distance of the lap. So basically here I have 2 laps, one of which is called short lap and another is called long lap. The long lap is made up of 2 segments, one going to the timing point and one coming back from that timing point. So it's a very common kind of setup where you have 2 different lap options, one of which is distinguished by there being a split point on course. And that course, that lap course, is made up of 2 different segments. The shorter one, in this case, is a simple, start to finish, back to start to finish, back to start to finish. Number one thing to keep in mind with lap splits is that lap locations must be identified as a lap location type. And that's all in the timing location setup. And then in the segment setup for laps, you'll want to make sure that you actually define the laps themselves by going in here and clicking Setup Laps. So the lap functionality is a bit different from the other kind of features in RaceDay scoring. But one of the things you need to know is that it uses the segment system, but it adds on this lap step to it. So by default, you just have a simple kind of lap setup where they're just doing one segment over and over and over again. But if you need to do more advanced setup like this one, you would come into your segment definitions, build out all of the constituent parts of any laps that you're going to be building that day, and then come in here and click Set Up Laps, and then make the laps that you need from the segments you have. So I think that's all we got for today. Didn't have any questions that I saw. Were there any questions from anyone before we head out for today?
Yeah, and as we wait for some questions, I wanted to highlight one aspect of race day scoring and segments and everything going on with timing integration. We definitely have timers out there that are wanting to stream data from their equipment points to RaceJoy in order to send out notifications. One thing you'll find is that you will need to have a segment set up. So even though you've got all your locations and your streams and all set up, they won't actually appear in the mapping to RaceJoy until you set up segments. So we need that segment distance to be defined so that we can kind of provide the proper mapping to RaceJoy for that cumulative point. So just another thing about segments, if you're doing time integration, very important for that.
We've got a question on the back end where kind of about the interaction between gap factor and minimum time for segments. One thing to note is that you don't need to set a minimum segment time. There may be situations where if it's a point-to-point race, there's no realistic way for them to read again there. It's still a good practice to do this, but with gap factors, if you are accepting multiple occurrences or expecting multiple occurrences on a timing point, you do need to set a gap factor. Otherwise, the system doesn't know how to parse the reads out there.
Yeah, I think to Christopher's question, they're asking for context here. They're saying that there's situations where they could have multiple conflicting settings, like there's the accept times until this time of day, and then there's a gap factor, and then there are also segment level gap factors, minimum times that you could set. And the important thing to understand is like you don't have to do all of them. You have to do the ones that you need to do. And there may be situations where you don't need to set up all of them. But I do think that there are situations where it's helpful to set up all of them. Specifically, like in that example where let's say you have a very basic layout. You have a common start finish race, but you have a 5K, a 10K, and a 15K. Now you could set a gap factor to make sure that people are doing, the minimum time between I guess that's not a good example. Maybe it's a better example could be you have a start and finish with a 5K and a marathon. So the minimum time between reads in general, you'd want to be 13 because you want from start to finish to make sure no one does less than 13 minutes. But you also want to make sure that no one's doing a marathon in 1 hour, right? So in that case, it's the same kind of course definition and everything, but you need to say that the gap factor is 13 minutes. But for this particular event, I want to make sure that it's set to be, a different time because the marathon is a whole lot longer. So that's one example of how you might want to use. In that case, it's really you're setting it on the scored event level, but it's a similar kind of idea.
I think. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah.
I was just gonna say, like for me, I think what makes the most sense with these pieces is to think about the location or the location in this case as applying to everything that's using it, but then you're really cutting down and defining what can be used on the scored event level and then on the segment level.
Yeah.
And so think of it as like location should be applicable to everything. So if you ever had a sprint try an Olympic triathlon, you would want the gap factor to be low enough that the sprint would be usable. And then to protect the Olympic triathlon from getting its results kind of out of whack, you would set this on the segment level for them. We've got a question from, did I answer it, Avery, you think?
I think so. Yeah, Chris, let us know if that answers the question. Hopefully it's helpful.
Yeah. Meanwhile, Andrew's got a question. Is it possible to establish a rest segment using a clock start as the endpoint information? What is the cumulative distance for the rest segment if the endpoint is at a clock start? So hypothetically, like just to kind of put this into some real world context, say you had that combo 5K, 10K event, but they're gun start events. Yeah, you could do the finish of the 5K as the start point for the rest segment, and the gun start for the 10K as the end of the rest segment. Cumulative distance, same as before. It's the amount of distance accumulated by the when you reach that end point. So in this case, because it's a rest segment between them, it would be the 5 kilometers. Emily is looking for the best way to set up a 3-lap race. For 3-lap race, I'd probably have that location that they're lapping on set to take those 3 occurrences, and I would set each lap up as a separate segment. There's not like a great hard and fast rule for how many laps is the point at which you'd flip over to setting as a lap event, but I don't know, probably 6-ish. You'd want to stick with just doing segments for that.
Another thing on that point to keep in mind for a race that happens to be 3 laps, you may or may not want to actually show all the details for each of the lap splits. Many times, if it's like a lap race where it's just they do 3 laps, but you really don't care about their individual segment times, you could just make it finish on the third occurrence. So it kind of depends on what the race organizers want to see and what is, to Soren's point earlier, what participants want to see. Maybe the lap distance doesn't make much sense. They just happen to do 3 of them, and all they really care about is their finish time. And in that case, you would just set up your timing location to accept 3 and then finish on the third occurrence. But it's kind of up to you.
It kind of goes back to like if you're wondering which to use, test it and think about like what you as a participant would expect to see.
Yeah, Chris is saying that he's still not sure about how to set all these, especially when it comes to troubleshooting. One of the things that you'll notice in terms of troubleshooting, reads will be ignored for a particular reason, and it'll tell you gap factor too short or minimum segment time. In particular, it'll tell you exactly why this read was ignored. So you should be able to find the reason why a read wasn't used. Now, to his other point here, he says they typically control for these factors using more physical means, which in my opinion is the best way. If you have any way of controlling data physically, definitely do that. It's much better than trying to rely on software to try and figure it out programmatically, because we know how it all is when things are a mess on the race site and you can't control where people are physically. It becomes really complicated to troubleshoot. And a lot of these features are built because many timers don't have that opportunity to control things physically like you do, Chris. So I would say if you know for a fact that you're never going to have these odd scenarios where people are getting red all over the place, and you don't need to lock it down as much as we're explaining here in some of these situations, that's totally good. And don't worry about it. You don't need to use most of these features.
So I think hopefully that kind of answers all the questions. I haven't seen anything new come in, but this is and also a good reminder that if you're new to segments, if you're new to building these things, if you're getting ready to use these to drive the bib timing integration with RaceJoy, get help is always your friend. We're always happy to look over your setups and give you some pointers on that. And then it's also a good reminder that next week we do have the advanced segment part. So this is kind of the foundational piece. And then next week we're going to get into some of the more advanced and specific scenarios. So, setting up RaceJoy for segments, missed segment reporting, some of the more complex lap situations and so on. We do have another question in there. It's a little bit more specific to kind of a missed read scenario. It's just asking about, they had a situation where they go from the mat to the turnaround, then back across the same mat, turn around and back. It's kind of out and back situation. They did have a situation where the overall winner skipped the second crossing. And that kept him out of scoring because he needed a certain number of occurrences. It just a note that if you do miss occurrences and you need them to order things, you do have to add them in manually.
Yeah, it's one of the drawbacks if you're relying on a single location to build out the segments. But not much you can do if you have limited hardware.
All right. Thanks everybody for joining us today, and just a reminder that we will send the slides and the recording out to you later. There's a couple links on those slides that you can click for some more information, and also to make sure that you're registered for next week's webinar.
Thanks, everyone. See you next time.